Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving into some pretty critical strategic remarks, the ones delivered by the president to Republican senators. This was right after a key election, and importantly, smack in the middle of that really historic government shutdown.
Mm-hmm. In that context, the immediate crisis is just crucial, isn't it? I mean, when you have air traffic control, SNAP benefits, these essential services being stressed because of a legislative stalemate, well, it creates enormous pressure to find some way to govern right now.
Absolutely. And the fundamental question that came out of the president's directive, it really hits the heart of American governance. It's about the necessity, maybe the wisdom, of getting rid of established Senate procedural norms right away. We're talking specifically, of course, about the legislative filibuster and that traditional blue slip custom for judicial nominees. Is that the only way to overcome what was clearly seen as just fundamental partisan obstruction?
Yeah, and it's more than just passing bills, right? It's a profound question about what the Senate is. Is it just a simple majoritarian body, or is it what the Constitution arguably designed, a chamber for deliberation where, protecting the minority view is actually paramount?
Well, my position, and I think it echoes the urgency you hear in those remarks, is that terminating these norms, well, it isn't just political convenience. It's a necessary step, it's urgent, and it's actually a strategic preemptive move. It's required, I'd argue, to facilitate effective governance today, and maybe even more critically, to prevent what looks like a guaranteed and frankly irreversible institutional defeat down the road.
Okay, I see that perspective, but I come at it quite differently. While I absolutely acknowledge the profound policy needs, I mean, ending the shutdown, pursuing major legislative goals, of course, I think terminating these traditional norms carries immense risk for long-term institutional stability. I believe it fundamentally undermines the Senate's core purpose and honestly could lead us into just a permanent state of legislative warfare.
I see why you'd prioritize stability, but let me offer a perspective maybe rooted more in just functional governance. When these remarks were made, the political system it had failed its most basic job, funding the government. That shutdown, as we said, was the longest in history. It really illustrated a political environment that, you could argue, demanded immediate, maybe even unilateral solutions because the existing rules, the procedures, had enabled total gridlock.
The shutdown was agonizing. I mean, there's no argument there. But I don't buy the idea that the institutional structure has to be sacrificed because of, temporary, albeit severe, legislative inconvenience. The Senate is designed to be slow. That's a feature, not a bug, right? It's designed to temper the passions of the moment, the passions of the majority.
But the president argued, quite pointedly, that without ending the filibuster, essentially zero substantive legislation would pass for the next, 3.25 years. That kind of paralysis prevents action on really crucial policy goals, things like securing elections through national voter ID, ending universal mail-in voting, things that, even the Bipartisan Carter Commission warned introduces vulnerabilities to corruption. The argument is we have to act now to secure those things.
And that emphasis on preemption, that's really central to your argument, isn't it? The justification given is that the opposition, if they gain power, they'll inevitably get rid of these norms anyway. And worse, they'll use that power to, quote, pack the court, maybe with multiple new justices, and grant statehood to places like D.C. and Puerto Rico. That fundamentally reshapes the whole electoral map, potentially securing a permanent legislative advantage for them.
Exactly. It's framed as a strategic necessity. Why would you preserve a defense mechanism if your opponent has basically broadcast their intention to dismantle it and then turn it against you? To weaponize that majoritarian rule? It doesn't seem logical.
That's a very compelling picture of sort of existential urgency. I grant you that. But it rests entirely on sacrificing the system's guardrails based on a hypothetical future action. My position holds that the core purpose of the Senate is minority protection. Terminating the filibuster is, I think, a tragic mistake that just guarantees an endless destructive cycle of policy reversal. Every new majority just undoes the work of the last one. So you might get short-term policy wins, sure, but you sacrifice any hope of long-term predictability or, frankly, consensus.
But what happens when the institutions themselves prevent any necessary governing action from happening?
Look at the blue slip custom. I illustrates this perfectly, I think. For listeners who might not know, the blue slip is this unwritten Senate rule. It allows home state senators to effectively veto judicial or U.S. attorney nominees just by withholding their consent, their blue slip. The remarks called its current operation a total disaster.
And while it is undoubtedly frustrating sometimes, that custom provides what I see as a necessary right of regional consultation on these really critical appointments. I mean, consider the specific evidence that was brought up. Jay Clayton, exceptionally well-regarded, highly qualified lawyer, former SEC chair, blocked for the Southern District of New York simply because of a negative letter from a single Democratic senator.
Right, but isn't that an extreme example of the custom being misused? Does its essence really hold up if it leads to that?
Well, I see its essence as institutional checks and balances. It prevents the federal government from just imposing purely unilateral appointments without any kind of regional or local buy-in.
I'd argue, though, that in practice, it's transformed into a veto power over the executive branch's constitutional authority to appoint officers. When a nominee like Clayton Flawless, highly qualified, gets blocked purely for partisan reasons, that custom isn't a check anymore. It's outright obstruction. It cripples the president's ability to fulfill their executive duties.
Okay, I acknowledge the policy frustration, especially during that shutdown. And yes, with appointments being blocked. But sacrificing the institutional structure for short-term legislative gains, even for policies that might be broadly popular, like, the tax cuts on tips, overtime, changes to Social Security that were mentioned, it guarantees a system where the majority just perpetually engages in legislative escalation. It erodes public confidence in our structures over the long run.
Okay, let's pivot then to maybe our first core point of debate, this logic underpinning preemption. You frame it as a moral hazard, an institutional hazard. I'm framing it more as self-preservation, really, facing an adversary who seems to have already signaled they're operating outside the traditional constraints. The source material explicitly claims the opposition is highly unrealistic and, crucially, intends to break these norms anyway.
I grant that the rhetoric around the minority's future intentions is, severe. But if we accept the logic that we must preemptively break norms because the other side might break them later, what are we left with? We've dismantled the very mechanism, the filibuster itself, that was designed to temper radical policies, whether it's court packing or unilateral statehood. If the Senate is truly meant to be a place of deliberation, we can't govern based on the most extreme projected actions of our opponents. That feels like it destroys the whole basis of mutual restraint.
But I'm not convinced that restraint is actually being rewarded right now. I mean, look at the failure to pass even something as basic as a government funding extension during that shutdown. That's usually considered easy, right? A measure that historically moves pretty quickly. Isn't that definitive evidence that the system is already fundamentally broken, that the minority was, at that point, determined to paralyze government functions entirely? If the Senate can't even do its basic administrative tasks, how on earth can it address major national crises?
That failure, while, yes, profound, it speaks more to political polarization, I think, than necessarily the failure of the filibuster as a concept. We need to maybe separate procedural failure from a lack of political will. But let's move to the mechanics of the blue slip custom, because this part of the debate is intensely relevant to the executive's ability to function.
Exactly. The president stated it very explicitly. This custom takes away the right of the president to pick people to serve on the court and to serve as U.S. attorneys. The Jay Clayton case, it really demonstrates an infringement on executive authority that seems to go way beyond simple checks and balances. Jay Clayton, according to the source material, was confirmed instantly by the courts themselves, and they were apparently incredulous that the Senate process hadn't approved him. You have a nominee with his pedigree, top schools, leading Sullivan and Cromwell, former SEC chair, blocked by a single negative letter. If the custom now functions mainly to ensure that only politically aligned nominees get through, well, then it stops being a check, doesn't it? It becomes more like an unconstitutional partisan veto.
That's an excellent counterpoint, focusing on the misuse of the custom. But it leads me back to the question of systemic quality. The blue slip custom historically was established to provide a crucial check. arguably constitutionally justifiable. U.S. attorneys, district judges, these are highly localized positions. They require deep regional knowledge. Some degree of local consent seems appropriate. Abolishing the custom entirely, I worry, leads to a less scrutinized, maybe lower quality selection process overall. You risk purely unilateral appointments driven by central political power, not necessarily regional needs or even legal merit. The risk of appointing, unqualified or purely political operatives just increases exponentially without any home state input.
But the quality of the nominee in the Clayton case specifically was unassailable. The issue wasn't merit, it was partisan power dynamics. If a custom allows a single senator to paralyze the appointment process indefinitely for reasons unrelated to qualification, then the executive branch effectively loses its power to enforce laws and maintain a functional judiciary in that entire region. If the process only works when the president and the state's senators happen to be aligned politically, then the process itself seems inherently biased against effective governance, especially under divided government.
Okay, fair point on the potential for paralysis. Let's broaden this out then to the ultimate stakes. The connection between this procedural structure and actual policy success. You're arguing that eliminating procedures is required to leverage the economic success that was happening, which the president highlighted, hottest economy we've ever had, record stock market highs, huge job creation, and to pass really consequential legacy-defining legislation.
Exactly. Stability without action is just failure when you're facing real crises. The argument is we must secure the border immediately, address the flow of illegal immigration, which the president framed quite starkly as an attack on our country and a failure of legislative enforcement, and we must solidify election integrity now. We were told explicitly we could pass national voter ID in 15 minutes if the filibuster was gone. That kind of policy success is the mechanism, the argument goes, by which the nation is improved, and yes, the opposition is prevented from getting the power that would enable their own destructive agenda.
It's a compelling case based on policy speed, certainly. But doesn't legislative success ultimately rely on coalition building, on legislative craftsmanship, not merely procedural shortcuts? If legislation, even with unified party control, still can't pass, maybe the problem lies partly in the appeal or the construction of the bills themselves, not solely on the filibuster. Consider the evidence right there in the source material that supports my view. The success of that great, big, beautiful bill, remember that? This bill, which contained, quote, 4 years' worth of goodies, including those tax cuts on tips, overtime, the Social Security changes, it passed. And it passed without eliminating the filibuster. That seems to show that major legislation can get through if the majority manages consensus properly and packages their wins in an attractive way.
But did that package include the really tough stuff like border security or voter ID?
Well, arguably, what the filibuster did in that scenario was force compromise. It forced packaging. And that led to a successful, maybe more durable outcome that wasn't immediately reversible. Eliminating the filibuster removes the incentive for that kind of essential, maybe difficult coalition building.
But you're forcing a compromise on what some see as fundamental issues, election security, border control, which are arguably more crucial to national stability in the long run than, say, tax adjustments. The president's perspective seems to be that we're being forced to choose between fundamental institutional change and policy paralysis on core, maybe even existential issues.
It's a difficult choice.
So I'd maintain that the cost of legislative inaction, particularly on those core issues, is far greater than the cost of breaking with a tradition that is arguably being demonstrably weaponized against the majority. The path to achieving that long-term vision, passing more consequential legislation than perhaps any Congress before, well, it lies in terminating the filibuster, maybe even this afternoon, as was suggested. That would enable immediate action on things like border security and stabilizing the electoral process.
And I would conclude by just re-emphasizing that stability really requires restraint. While I agree the opposition, as portrayed, exhibits extreme obstructionism, ending core Senate traditions like the filibuster, it invites permanent political warfare. It essentially guarantees that any policy gains made today, even popular ones on the economy or election security, will just be quickly and frankly brutally reversed the moment power inevitably shifts. And that leaves the nation with degraded, ultimately ineffective institutions that only serve the temporary, fleeting whims of the majority. We have to resist that urge, I think, to destroy the very mechanisms that ensure minority perspectives have some voice in the long-term governance of the country.
It is certainly a profound conflict, isn't it? That immediate imperative for effective, decisive policy response versus the long-term health and stability of our core political institutions.
Mm-hmm. Listeners will have to weigh those risks themselves, the risks of procedural escalation versus the risks of legislative gridlock, especially when facing what are perceived as national crises. Thank you. This was indeed an essential discussion.